Welcome to this video. This is the second video in a series of videos which I'm making, covering some of the contents of Stanisław Leśniewski's work which, in English, is titled On the Foundations of Mathematics. The original title in Polish was O Podstawach Matematyki. Before we get started, please remember to hit the subscribe button and give this video a like. Don't forget to hit the alerts button as well so you'll know whenever I upload a new video. The translations in this video into English from Polish are all my own. As mentioned in previous videos, sometimes I'm not able to translate Leśniewski in a way which captures all of the detail and nuance of what he says in Polish. So I'll sometimes need to paraphrase and get the main ideas across rather than attempting to get all of the detail. We have to bear in mind that Leśniewski has some relatively unique views on sets, classes and aggregates that are in many ways very different from the usual contemporary view of set. It's important to bear this in mind when trying to understand Leśniewski and not judge the validity of Leśniewski's arguments according to this modern conception of set. Indeed, Leśniewski has been criticised for his views on classes. A quote, attributed to Leon Fistek, can be found in the book The Logical Systems of Leśniewski by Eugene Luskay and reads, "Throughout Leśniewski's life, there was on the whole no time when he understood the concept of a class." Fistek, who was initially on good terms with Leśniewski, but later became critical of Leśniewski after Leśniewski found a flaw in Fistek's work. The above quote seems to be from this latter period. I'll typically not be commenting on the correctness of Leśniewski's results or deductions. I'll be trying to present things as closely as possible from Leśniewski's perspective and therefore, I'll try my best to explain Leśniewski's logical deductions, but I can't be 100% certain that A. This will always be possible, and B. That my explanations will be exactly what Leśniewski intended. A critical analysis of Leśniewski, if there is to be one, will be left for some other time. Literature on Leśniewski's work is rare and difficult to come by, and all very expensive. Therefore, I've not necessarily had the luxury of being able to profit from the already existing analyses of Leśniewski's work. A digital copy of the parts of this work that are covered in this video is in the public domain and available to download. I'll include a link to the download in the description to this video. Chapter 2. This chapter is titled On the Antinomy of Mr. Russell relating to the class of classes which are not elements of themselves. Chapter 2 is a relatively short chapter, and it presents a critical analysis of Russell's antinomy on the class of classes which are not elements of themselves, as well as presenting Leśniewski's solution to this antinomy. Leśniewski has the tendency to use the Polish word podporządkowany, which translates into English as subordinate, rather than element. Thus we see phrases such as an object which is subordinate to a class, rather than an object which is an element of a class. I'll usually stick with Leśniewski's terminology and therefore use the word subordinate whenever Leśniewski uses the word podporządkowany. Chapter 2 starts off with Leśniewski commenting briefly on a series of his early works which he has since renounced. He says that he began to become acquainted with the antinomies of Bertrand Russell, relating to the class of classes which are not elements of themselves, and the problems relating to the antinomies became a constant theme for Leśniewski for the next 11 years or so, but which led Leśniewski to certain results. On page 183 in a footnote, Leśniewski gives some indication in note 1 on this page about why he may have decided to renounce his earlier works. Referring to a passage that he wrote in his work titled A Critique of the Logical Principle of the Excluded Middle, he says, "At the time of writing that passage, I believed that there existed in the world so-called properties and so-called relations as two special kinds of objects, and I didn't feel any guilt in using the expressions property and relation. Currently, I no longer believe, and haven't for some time, in the existence of objects which are properties, nor in the existence of objects which are relations." Also in a footnote at the bottom of page 186, Leśniewski also says of his earlier work titled, Is the class of classes not subordinate to themselves subordinate to itself? In this miserable attempt, I expressed my views on the antinomy of Mr. Russell. Not yet having my own axiomatization of the theory of classes, my progress was, in this regard, completely typical of the progress of all those set theoreticians who do not construct their theories on clear axiomatic foundations. The particular formulation of Russell's antinomy that Leśniewski was first introduced to was that in Jan Łukasiewicz' book mentioned in chapter 1 of this work titled, in Polish, O zasadzie sprzeczności u Arystotelesa, or in English, the principle of contradiction in Aristotle. Łukasiewicz writes in his book, about objects which belong to a given class, we say that they are subordinate to the class. Continuing with the excerpts from Łukasiewicz's book, Łukasiewicz points out that, most often, a class is not subordinate to itself since, as a set of elements, a class generally has different properties than the elements separately. He gives some examples to illustrate this, such as the set of people is not itself a person, the set of triangles is not itself a triangle, and so on. He introduces the notion of a full class, which is simply a class to which belong some elements. He also points out that not all classes are full. Indeed, some classes are empty. He forms the class of all full classes and says that since the class of full classes is itself a full class, then the class of full classes is subordinate to itself. That is, it is an element of itself. Łukasiewicz then forms the class of classes which are not subordinate to themselves. He's already given some examples of such classes, and it's easy to see that such classes are abundant. The class of classes which are not subordinate to themselves, Łukasiewicz calls K. We're then led to the question, is the class K subordinate to itself or not? Of course, this question leads to a version of Russell's antinomy which is presented on page 185. This antinomy caused Leśniewski to think more carefully about the kinds of things, objects, he considered as classes or sets, and subjects to a critical analysis his belief in the particular assumptions which led to the antinomy. Leśniewski says that from his first encounter with the notion of the empty class, he treated it as a mythological concept and took the position that 1. If some object is the class of A's, then some object is an A. The subject of the empty class is dealt with in more detail in chapter 3. Of course, whether Leśniewski was right to have treated the empty class as a mythological concept is debatable, but I won't be subjecting Leśniewski's views to any in-depth criticism here. Leśniewski arrived at some results which he became convinced were correct, namely, 2. It constantly happens that such and such an object is the class of such, and simultaneously the class of objects entirely different. And 3. If one and only one object is a P, then P is the class of P's. Moving forward then, in order to understand Leśniewski's deductions, we will have to accept temporarily and without too many questions points 2 and 3 as representing Leśniewski's convictions. Whether 2 and 3 are correct will have to be considered another time. All we can take from Leśniewski's comments are that his intuitions seem to have led him to the conclusions 2 and 3. It's worth noting a comment that he makes in the introduction to his earlier work, Foundations of the General Theory of Aggregates, which says that the psychological source of my axioms is my intuition, which means simply that I believe my axioms are true. And also, my axioms do not have a logical source, which simply means that the axioms do not have a proof in my system. It would seem then that Leśniewski relied on his intuitions as a guide. Leśniewski says that he established the following definition, that P is subordinate to the class K if and only if when, through some meaning of the expression A, are satisfied the conditions alpha, K is a class of A's, and beta, P is an A. This definition suggests that the P's which are subordinate to the class K can be different kinds of objects depending on the meaning of A that is selected. See my Foundations of the General Theory of Aggregates video 3. Some of page 187 is taken up with a bit of autobiographical detail regarding Leśniewski's use of notation, which I'll pass over here. The symbol A jest B, or in English A is B, as seen on page 187, is an example of singular predication, which is dealt with in more detail, it seems, in chapter 11. From Luskai's book we see that A is B can be understood to mean, for example, the soul A is A or the soul B, individual A is one of the one or more B, A is an individual that is B, A is one of the one or more individuals that are B, and so on. I won't dwell on this point here. There are certain difficulties which arise with the translation of P jest A into English. This may mean P is A or P is an A. Sometimes the context clarifies, but sometimes it doesn't. The use of an article is logically unnecessary, but, of course, proper use of articles will help the language feel a bit more natural. Sometimes I'll sit on the fence and include a possible article in brackets. Point 7 is obtained from 3 and 5 with the meaning of A being a class. Point 7 is obtained with a simple syllogism. 8 follows from 7 and 6 with the meaning of A in 6 being a class. 8 is then a kind of logical product of 7 and 6. The sum meaning of the expression A in 9 is if A means P. 10 follows easily from 9 and 4, and from 10 Leśniewski deduces 11, that no object is a class which is not subordinate to itself. And regarding 11, see also proposition 26 of Foundations of the Theory of Aggregates. For 12, if there was an object that was the class of classes which are not subordinate to themselves, then, since the object is a class, there must be, by 1, some object which is a class which is not subordinate to itself, which contradicts point 11. By accepting this sequence of deductions, and therefore point 12, Leśniewski says that the sense of antinomy completely disappears in both of the assumptions that the class of classes which are not subordinate to themselves is subordinate to itself, and that the class of classes which are not subordinate to themselves is not subordinate to itself, since there is no such object to which either of these statements applies. Perhaps by this Leśniewski is suggesting that rather than Russell's antinomy be a logical antinomy, it's merely a semantic antinomy, that Russell's antinomy really represents a meaningless string of words, but is such that the string of words can very easily appear to be meaningful. On page 189, the diagram referred to is the diagram on page 186. Points 13 and 14 are immediate from 2 and 15 is obvious. For point 17, replace the P of point 4 with interval AC and the K of point 4 with interval AB. 18 refers to the fact that, as in 14, the interval AB can be considered as the class of intervals which are either AD or DB. Leśniewski rejects the assumption based on the argument presented at the end of page 188 and beginning of page 189 that, if K is a class of A's and P is subordinate to the class K, then P is an A. In the above, 1, replace K with the class of classes which are not subordinate to themselves, replace A with class subordinate to itself, and finally replace P with the class of classes which are not subordinate to themselves. And by making these substitutions, we arrive at the result 2. And then in 6, by replacing P with the class of classes which are not subordinate to themselves, and replace A with subordinate to the class of classes which are not subordinate to themselves, then using the result from the previous paragraph, 2, we obtain the result 3. Therefore, by rejecting the assumption 1, it makes it impossible for the result 3 to be obtained. The paragraph 3 can be interpreted as meaning, by means of a slight rewording, the class of classes not subordinate to themselves is not subordinate to the class of classes which are not subordinate to themselves. And this brings us to the end of Leśniewski's solution to Russell's antinomy and the end of the chapter. Thank you for watching. If you found this video useful, then please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. You can see more videos on various topics on my channel, and if you have any suggestions for topics for future videos, please feel free to let me know and I'll try my best to put something together. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and keep an eye out for new videos being uploaded to my channel.